Second player press start.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Second Player Press Start. My name is James and I'm joined by my friend
Darren, that's me.
And today we're going to talk about a zombie survival game, State of Decay 2. It's available on Xbox One. I don't think it's available on any other platforms.
Is it not on PC?
Might be on PC.
I'm trying to think if it was on Steam.
I know for sure it's a Microsoft Xbox exclusive. And if you want to give this game a try, it's available on the Game Pass service, which is kind of Microsoft's like Netflix style. Pay a monthly fee and you get access to, I think it's like over 100 games now. And all of their first party titles are part of that too, so
Interesting.
yeah, pretty good deal there. So I figured this game was probably more of a Darren game than a James game, so I handed the controller to Darren. And what were your kind of initial impressions?
Well, the fact that it's number 2 means that there was a previous game. To my assumption, I remember hearing the name of the game and that it was something about zombies, but that's all I really knew about it coming in. I think overall, after just playing it now for about an hour, I'm interested to continue, but I'm interested also in why, just if you explain a little bit that, what makes it a Darren game versus a James game. I'm interested in that delineation.
From what I heard about this game, it was very kind of like systems based, I guess you could. And oh man, was it ever systems based? Like,
Sure.
there is a lot to this game. Starting out, I found the game did kind of a good job in kind of tutorializing the gameplay as far as, this button hits and this button jumps and this button runs. And even just kind of the initial character select screen was kind of an interesting
Right.
choice right up front. Gave you a bit of flavor text kind of describing the dynamic relationship between what pair you decided to choose. And Darren picked Hector and Astra.
Astra, yeah.
And Darren picked them based on her love of gardening.
Yeah, and she was in mourning, and I forget what Hector's thing was. He was like chemistry, but then there was some other weird little, outlier thing about his personality or something. I just don't remember what it was. But yeah, I thought it was, from the character selection screen, we had played A Way Out, one of the earlier games that we played. And we had a character selection where we had to choose between those characters. And we had, again, a little flavor text description. And then we were just choosing whether James plays Leo and the other dude. But we commented at that point that it wasn't a big decision space because we didn't know enough about the differences between the character to say that one's gameplay was going to be much different than the others. Whereas in this, not only was there the pair to choose between, but I think there was 4 different pairs. And the other thing that stood out to me in terms of diversity, a lot of the pairs were people of color. And I think it's possible that 1 out of those 8 people was maybe a white person.
But the lighting was little weird. Yeah.
And the coloring was a little hard to tell about skin color and stuff like that. So we kind of based it on maybe some of the features of the people as well as their names and what looked to be skin color. But another thing in terms of diversity is one of the couples was this couple that it said in their flavor text they had broken up 10 times in the last 10 years or something like that and got back together. But it was 2 women, which was a really interesting thing to see in that capacity. And one thing I saw from that, for me, from the very onset of the game, is this game is all about just real people in this situation. And the fact that Astra, like one of her specialties was gardening, you're like, well, what does that have to do with the zombie survival game? And then you realize as you delve into some of these systems that once you secure a location to set up a home base, you can set up a garden, and that gives you resources for food on an ongoing basis. So I thought that introduction to it was really interesting because I didn't need to know those systems to know that gardening mattered in some capacity, because she had a score of 3 in gardening. But it also gave me a chance to pick somebody who I otherwise wouldn't normally envision in a zombie killing game, right? This isn't playing Left 4 Dead, obviously, right?
Right.
And right from the beginning, I know this isn't playing Left 4 Dead. Yes, I'm going to be killing zombies and there's going to be that tension element to it, but it's going to have a very different feel. And I think that set me up right off the bat. So I thought that was really effective.
Yeah, I mean, the game starts once you've selected your characters, and even in that initial select screen, like, just that one paragraph of text, like, really paints a picture of this pair. And then right away you start looting, which seems to be a pretty huge component, and you have the option to kind of loot slow and quiet, or loot fast and potentially draw attention to yourself, which I thought was pretty, like, it's a smart idea. I know it's been done in other games, but just that sense of kind of risk and reward of do I speed this process up in order to get this quicker but then draw more attention to myself?
Sure.
Or do I take my time? And it seemed like it didn't really affect what was inside of the loot crate, so to speak.
Yeah, our first expectation, because there was no indication on the screen what would happen if we went faster, if we went slow. When you walk up to a crate, it has the little Y icon, so you're supposed to hit the Y button to interact with it. It says that it's a crate or something to search, so Y search. And when you hit it, a little timer comes up that shows that if you hold Y, you'll get to the end of this. And it takes, 10, 15 seconds, maybe somewhere in there. But then it also shows that if you hold your bumper, your left bumper, then you can search faster. And at first it didn't give any indication of what the difference between the two was. And we found out through doing it multiple times. Eventually there was a pop-up that came up on the screen that said very explicitly, if you search fast, you risk making more noise and then drawing attention to yourself. But at first, because that wasn't there and we had no idea, our first expectation was maybe if you don't take enough time searching, there's less for you to find. There's always the possibility that you'll find less things if you don't search long enough. That didn't happen to be the case, but that was my first expectation.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be you do the quick thing and then, like, you might not get as much as if you take your time, but it didn't really seem to be the case. This game does a weird job of, like, explaining some things really well and then not explaining or visually indicating other things.
Right.
This game is pretty janky. There is something kind of charming about kind of the jank. Like, it's a video game. Right. Like, the cutscenes are pretty terrible. Like, the in-engine, there's a few instances of when you first meet the Doctor. That cutscene kind of looked like out of a PS2 game to me. Like, it was very kind of robotic puppets kind of talking to each other, especially after playing something like God of War.
Sure.
Or even Detroit, where, you can see the emotion in someone's face.
Right.
These guys looked very robotic, and but I don't think the game's strength really lies in its kind of presentation.
Sure.
It's pretty heavy.
Or even maybe presentation is the wrong word, because there is some aspects that I think were presented well, but maybe you mean more of like the visual cinematic kind of like realism feel to it.
And I mean, for me, I look at games kind of through that lens of kind of the art direction and kind of the technical achievement. Maybe more so than kind of, the systems. Right. I guess that maybe that's kind of my style versus yours, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this game is kind of rough around the edges, but
yeah, some of the examples that I saw from playing it, we were talking about searching crates, but you have to angle your character in a lot of situations to face very specifically this area on the screen in order to even get the search button pop up. There was a time in particular, I was at the back of our SUV trying to look in the trunk, and I'm facing the trunk and that button doesn't pop up. So I turn my character. In fact, I turn 180 degrees so I'm facing away from the trunk, and that's when the button pops up to search. So there's little elements like that where you're spending, it's half a second or a second or whatever trying to figure out how to face this item to actually interact with it. And there's polish elements like that which seem to detract from the experience of the game. But when you consider the scope of the game, it's hard to say. Like, I don't know, the fact that Microsoft, you're saying, was a publisher of this, I'm not sure who the developer was. And I assume if it's State of Decay 2, it's probably a team that was working on the first one, and now they have a bigger publisher behind them, and maybe now, they've got more money and they can increase that scope from where they were the first time through. But another thing that I remember in terms of jankiness was it was a nighttime sequence, and I think I'd fallen down the edge of a little cliff or hill type area, and I really liked the animation when the dude fell on his face. Like, that was really appealing to me, because there's some of the animations and the way the characters move that to me work really well. Like, they have a good feel, they have a good look to them. But when he rolled down the hill for whatever reason, or it was just before that, but then all of a sudden my HUD started flashing. Like, little, things would get a little bit brighter and a little bit dimmer in the HUD, whether it was on the mini map or things like that. And there was no reason for it. It wasn't trying to alert me to anything.
Yeah,
it was
I think
just
something
a
glitched. Yeah.
And then eventually it goes back to normal. So there's little bits like that in terms of polish that they just left, for lack of a better word. And I remember we found an option in the menu to, if your character gets stuck, it takes 2 minutes, and you have to connect with some, through your radio system or something to get unstuck. But it doesn't work if you're in a vehicle or something like that. Do you remember?
Yeah, it was almost like a button of if your character somehow clips into a wall and you get stuck, press this button to kind of fix it. Sure. Which I could see that happening just through some of the kind of jankiness that we kind of encountered.
And for me, there's an endearing aspect about that to this game, that there's this huge scope of it. There's this huge scale of the world and the amount of stuff you can do and the amount of decisions and how all those decisions affect each other. And at the same time, the things about moving through the world or interacting with an object are just a little bit crazy sometimes. So, I mean, on the one hand, you look at the presentation of the game in terms of all those positives I mentioned, and you're like, maybe I can forgive it for some of these small things. But then, who knows? There's other games that are faulted for similar stuff. Like, people talk about crazy cameras or things like that. Now, cameras are one of those things that in the last 10 years have improved so much from what they were when we started playing PlayStation 1, right?
Yeah, and I think we've almost developed a language of how a camera should react, or even down to control schemes now, right?
Sure.
If you play enough of video games, you kind of know what each button's generally going to do, or how the camera's more or less going to react. So
right. It's also speaking of polish again, it's pretty standard for when a game starts up that has a particular graphical feel or atmosphere that they want to convey, especially when there's dark and light sequences, that they give you an option to change the brightness level. Pretty standard, right? You load up the game and it gives you a brightness. But what it does in most games is it gives you a point of reference. Like this black square you shouldn't be able to see, and this white square you should be able to see. So change your brightness to affect that. In this one, it just said change your brightness, but it didn't give us any reference point as to what dark or light should look like. So even again, we've got another example of them using a regular mechanism in a game to change brightness, but it's not polished enough to actually work in the way that would be most optimal. So I think that's a really interesting, like, to me, that's almost the perfect example of how this game is overall, is that they've got all these systems in the game that are meant to do certain things, but because of that small lack of polish, these are things that we notice in playing and in trying to interact with it. And probably moments, you know, if you're going to put an X amount of hours in this game, if every few minutes you're interacting with a loot crate and you're having trouble interacting with it, that's just going to be an impedance to you playing more and giving it more of your attention, because it's just this point of frustration that's going to happen over and over and over again. So I don't know. What do you think of that kind of stuff? Like, have there been other games for you where you're engaged enough in the game to overlook those moments, or conversely, where those moments are just so frustrating that you're like, you know, I love what they're trying to do here, but I just can't engage with it?
Oh, I know there have been games where I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Right. Some of the things that are really frustrating for me is when a game adds elements from a certain genre of games, let's say platformer, where the game inherently is not a platformer, right?
Right.
So like I've played a top-down like isometric RPG where they've put a jump button in for no other reason than there's this one sequence in some dungeon somewhere where you have to do this jump sequence, otherwise you die and start over. And that kind of thing always bugs the hell out of me, because there's no point for it. They're like, hey, here's this, we never needed a jump button in this game until this point, and the only reason this point is in here is to make this challenge dungeon, but it doesn't fit with anything else that has been presented in the game. So very few, you know, there's very few QA people working on making this sequence functional, and instead it's just frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one huge thing was the building. Towards the end of the game, one of the objectives was it the supply facility?
Yeah, they talked about there was a supply. There was like a supply. I think they had two supply things, right? There was,
and that's what kind of threw us off, because it was referencing. I'm getting them mixed up.
Like supply management, and then like a supply warehouse or something like that.
Yeah, and it was referencing the other one without really highlighting it on the map. And it was only through kind of trial and error and kind of wandering around a little bit that it kind of triggered something.
Sure.
And then we kind of stumbled upon it. But
right.
That seemed like a pretty huge one, because it seemed like up until that point it was trying to kind of guide you through a little bit of saying, you know, do this step, then this step, to just kind of get a feel for the rest of the game. But
right.
For whatever reason, it didn't trigger that, and we probably spent, 20 minutes kind of going back and forth, trying to figure out, okay, where do these resources have to go? Right. And then once it kind of triggered, it kind of clicked, and it all made sense.
Yeah, there's just to give some context, but in the world, whether you're we were in this area where there's some construction going on in new houses, and I guess whenever the zombie apocalypse happens, everything stops, right? So we're searching some of these unconstructed houses or sheds or whatever for these items. And in particular, we're looking for what they call rucksacks in the game. There's these big packs full of resources. And some are food, and some are fuel, and some are ammunition. And I think there was materials one as well. So we're looking for a particular rucksack. And in order to build this infirmary in our base, right? But what happens when you pick up this rucksack, you can also break this rucksack down into its components, which are then individual use items like medicine and stuff like that. But if you keep it all stocked together, it's actually a resource for your base and not for you as an individual, or not for your individual people. So we kept going to this supply area and then breaking down the rucksack and turning it into its components, which are individual usage things for your folks. Instead, we had to go to another place in the base, which wasn't very well notified, and give that location the entire sack of goods, which then gave us the resources we need to do more meta elements like build our infirmary. Once we solved that, everything was fine. Like, okay, now we know how to do this. But the reason it took us 20 minutes is because you can only carry one rucksack at a time. So you bring it back to the base and you break it down into components, which we shouldn't have done. And then we have to go out into the world and find a new one. All the while, there's zombies and there's searching and all this kind of thing. So that's where that extra time comes in, because it wasn't shown well enough for us to know what the difference between those two resources are and how we're supposed to interact with them. So I'm pretty sure that there's elements throughout the game where there's probably more times we're going to run into those issues, just based on the fact that it happened once in this very significant moment, that I can only imagine that there's other times when it's not as important to the game that we're still going to run into those issues. But I found I knew that this game would have a depth to it simply by, on the title screen when we first started, that there was a how to play thing. And it's very rare these days anyway to see a how to play opening option on your title screen, simply because there's enough depth here that you want to get a feel for what to do before you do it, because the tutorial, in my opinion, isn't built to show you the entire game. So I went through that a little bit, but even there, I noticed some of those exact same tutorial screenshots or whatever showing up in game as well, to walk me through the exact same things I had already read through. So I'm not sure if that how to play thing there was necessary, or if there's certain things maybe they should have focused on more in that area than they should have, instead of just duplicating it in game. What are your thoughts on that? The tutorialization versus the manual ahead of time. We don't see game manuals anymore. Yeah,
I mean, that initial screen up front is almost like that old school, like the manual that comes in the game box as you drive home from the game store after your parents, let you pick up a game for your birthday or whatever.
Right.
I think we've just come far enough that games can do a better job in putting you in an environment and kind of teaching you as you play. And it seems like it almost tried to do that in the beginning, like I said, with press X to swing your bat or whatever, or press this button to grab the zombie, or press this button to stealth. It seemed like they kind of started to do that, but then it's like, well, we have all of these systems that are so complex. The only way we can really show this or solve this problem of telling the players by just having them read it.
Right.
Maybe that's just the nature of a more complex game. But I think there's got to be a smarter way of handling that, or perhaps they don't want 5 hours of tutorials.
Sure.
Maybe it is quicker to just kind of read.
So, speaking of survival games and this idea of tutorialization, but did you ever play Don't Starve?
That's kind of the 2D-esque island.
Yeah, you wake up and you're a dude in the middle of nowhere. You don't know how you got there. There's this weird kind of demon type character that disappears, and then you're just there. And it's essentially you're trying to find out how long you can survive based on the things that you salvage off the land, and if you can survive from, these oncoming attacks of insanity and these monsters in the area and that kind of thing. But in that game, the reason I bring it up is because, yes, it's survival, similar to this one, but there's no tutorial anything. There's nothing on the screen. There's no indication of anything that you have to do. It's just this kind of implicit from this, maybe even from this demon character, but see how long you can last here, like good luck kind of thing.
Right.
And then you walk over and maybe you find some berries or something and you're allowed to collect them, and the little pop-up comes up to interact with it. Or maybe you find your way and you manage to pick up like a sapling, and then you can convert that into, you can eventually get firewood, and then you need flint to start a fire and all this kind of thing. But none of that is taught to you. You learn by doing. And part of it is because it's the idea of a roguelike game where once you die, you're dead and you just have to start over. Because the game assumes you're going to be playing this multiple times, that you're going to learn from your mistakes, right? Or your failures, and you're going to improve on your systems and your understanding and your knowledge of the game in order to progress further and further each time, like a standard roguelike.
Yeah.
This game doesn't have that feel, and I wonder if right at the beginning, if all they had to say, apart from doing the tutorial as they did it, was, look, like in this game doesn't have life and death in the same way that other survival horror games do, but this game expects these types of things from you, right? And to give just a broad expectation of what this game expects, so that when you start playing the game and you realize there's some things that there's just so much going on that I can't figure it out all at once, the realization or even the encouragement from the game that says, you know what, don't worry, like you're not going to lose overnight. There's lots of things going on, and we're trying to do this in the game. And I've seen some games in the past, and I've seen some games even used as examples of this in videos and stuff online, to say that it's really a positive experience when a game trusts you as a player and gives you a lot of the decision making and a lot of the power to go through this and realize that it's okay if you forget to, you don't have enough food the first night or whatever, because that's not the end of the game. Like there's so much more going on here.
Right.
You're just going to learn as you go, and that's totally fine. Now, from the tutorial, I didn't get that feeling for this game. I thought I was doing something wrong, right? Or that I was doing something suboptimally, but maybe that's not such a big deal. And I just don't know from the way it was presented.
Yeah. I think this game is definitely, the more you invest your own time into it, I think the more rewarding it will be. And there is a lot to this.
Right.
I think we barely kind of scratched the surface.
Agreed. Yeah.
Watching you play, I respect what it's doing, but I don't think it would be a game for me. Even knowing what I know now, I don't think I don't think I'll have the patience to, or even the time to really kind of learn all the nuances of what this game has to offer, because it's just so much.
Sure. And see, conversely, I totally agree when you say time. Like for me to invest the kind of time that this game would require would be hard for me to do. But I also know that some of the multiplayer stuff built in, I'm not sure how tightly integrated some of the multiplayer is, in terms of it looked like you could just ask for help from other players and then they would maybe give you resources or some trading element, but not necessarily playing like a co-op game. But the idea of a co-op where you and I sit down and we're both responsible in our own time, maybe asynchronously. Maybe James plays his session and collects a bunch of the stuff that we need for our thing. And then I play at a totally different time of the day and I collect stuff and I see what James has collected. And because they have this whole sleep cycle system built into all your survivors as well. When my guy started getting tired, his stamina was getting lower and lower and lower so that I could only fill it up to a certain amount of time. And it was showing this 3 Zs for sleep. So I just switched to another character and then all of a sudden he was rested and then my Hector, the original guy I was playing with, went to sleep. So just that idea of this open world where you can play as long as you want or as short as you want and collect some resources here, and then it affects your home or your party or whatever, I thought was really compelling. And to be able to do that with other people would be, I think, a really fascinating game experience. And like I said, I just don't know how integrated that is from what they showed on the screen, what multiplayer looks like in that space. So I don't know. I mean, it's something that I could see myself, even tonight, only playing for about an hour, but wanting to get more stuff, to build more things, to explore more of the world, to interact with new systems. For me, I was really curious about all of that. But perhaps that depth is something that I'm looking for in that way that you're not.
So was I right? Was it a daring game after all?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really into it. I could see, like, I don't have an Xbox, but I could see if there was, on PC, I'm going to check it out on Steam, see if that's an option. I know that Steam always does summer sales and stuff, so it might be something I'll see what I can find out. But yeah, I'm sold on it. I think that this is the kind of game I could see as well, again, because of all these systems. I could definitely see this being a game that went through early access on Steam or things like that and really got some community investment as well. Because I guarantee there's people out there that are so invested in this game, and this is like the source of their YouTube content and all that kind of thing. It wouldn't surprise me to see that.
Yeah, I'm just looking up to see if this is a PC title. I think you might actually be in luck. Yep, it's available on PC as well. So,
right.
And it looks like there is kind of PC, Xbox crossplay as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I think they are bringing this Game Pass service to PC as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to play it. Because, yeah, if you were kind of building your base and you invited me in to come kind of hang out with you and go scavenge some stuff and just smash up some zombies, like,
sure,
I think that would be a pretty fun time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see kind of how that multiplayer aspect works.
Sure. Well, that's my final thoughts on it. I'm excited to see where the game goes. I'm excited to see how much more they plan to develop for it, if this is one of those standalone things or because they've got this community backing behind it, if it turns into something bigger than that, like an MMO would, where they're constantly releasing content. Yeah, that's my opinion. I'm glad I got to give it a shot.
And interesting little tidbit. The developers, Undead Labs, I know Microsoft, who just had their E3 press conference, announced that they're actually acquiring that developer.
Okay.
So if they continue to make these games, it'll be interesting to see if State of Decay 3 comes out with some Microsoft cashola kind of behind them.
Sure.
Maybe if they can refine some of kind of the rough edges, what kind of game it could be.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of games that have this large epic scale to them, but you don't need, in the way you're introduced to the game, we were talking about God of War, for example, you don't need to have a full understanding as a player about every single interaction and mode of play and system in the game in order to start into that experience. And I think there's a way, they tried to do it here, but I think once you get into that full open world section and there's just so many options, I think you could have instead kept the world smaller and just continued to branch out as you learn more about the game, which would make for a much more engaging and a much more controlled play experience for first timers. Because this game I can see being really difficult for new players to get into they're expecting a Left 4 Dead, fight zombies, kill zombies, but there's this other layer of survival, right? Of collecting and crafting and stuff. If that's how the game is marketed or presented, then I think the people who first experience this game are going to have trouble crossing that gap, right? Between I wanted a zombie action game with an extra level or an extra layer of depth. And I think this goes above and beyond that, but that can actually be a detriment to the way people first interact with it.
For sure. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap up this episode.
Yeah.
We'll be back to talk about more video games in the future. Until then, good night, Darren.
Good night, James.